Good afternoon. My name is Tina Emery. I'm one of the co-chairs of the National Network of Parent Care Forums. Thank you for you joining us today. There's quite a few of you. We have heard that there's going to be probably over 100 at some point this afternoon. I just want to introduce you to our guests. So first of all, we've got Andre Imick. Andre, do you want to say hello?
Hello, everyone. Andre Imick. I'm the SEN and Disability Professional Advisor in the Department for Education.
And we've also got Suzy Powell. Suzy, would you like to say hello?
Hi, I'm Suzy Powell. I am the Deputy Director of SEND Policy and Strategy in the Department for Education.
Thank you. It's great to see you all here today. If you want to make sure you're all on mute, that'll be great. And for those with bandwidth issues, if you'd like to switch your camera off, and hopefully we'll get through this session with everybody who's attended first. So first of all, we want to talk some of the questions that we had in this week. So we've had multiple questions on COVID-19, Suzy, and therefore I'm going to start by asking you what's the department doing in regards to COVID recovery and including access to therapies, and how are we going to learn more about COVID and its response moving forward?
Okay, thanks Tina, and thank you to those that put questions in on COVID. Obviously this feels more relevant than ever, particularly over the last few days with recent events. So I'll take this into sort of discrete chunks. So I think just to state the obvious, and we know and we're acutely aware that the pandemic disproportionately impacted children and young people with SEND and their families. And all the work that we've done over the past 18 months, 2 years, has been really focused on committing to helping all of those pupils, particularly those with SEND, to make up all their lost learning. So part of that has been around the money. And you'll all know this, but over the course of the pandemic, we've announced, I think it's around 4.9 billion of funding on education recovery. Now, that's a kind of obviously across the board. So there's a big focus on actually tailoring that funding the right way so it properly benefits children and young people with SEND. And just a few examples of the way that we've done that. So some of that funding, we gave additional uplifts to those who attended specialist settings, just recognising that the catch-up premium and the recovery premium just had to go further, and particularly in specialist settings. I think you're all aware of the tuition fund as well. And we've made sure that that has been able to sort of cater to the needs of children and young people with SEND. So as of now, there are 41 approved partners, and 26 of those are specifically tailored for children and young people with SEND. So we've made sure that it sort of represents all children. And we, again, on the money side, we put in some additional funding into the Family Fund Trust, so provide direct support to families who are sort of in crisis over the pandemic. So things like toys, IT, depending on what the particular needs of that family were. Then I think there's just back to the point around kind of how do we know what works, and that's a focus from now on, I think. So there is some evaluation of the current recovery work going on. So there's some metrics that's developing. Some of this is around the whole education recovery package, but there's some things around specific interventions as well, and specific groups of learners. So for example, there have been evaluations of national tutoring programme that have been put in place. And also you may have seen yesterday, we're sort of putting through some piloting training for assistive technology champions. And I think that goes back to sort of one of the questions we're asked about kind of how we learn about what has worked well. I think we hope through that assistive technology champion, we can really understand better how that technology and how it's been used through the pandemic can reduce and remove the barriers for learners with SEND.
Thank you. And Minister Quince actually mentioned about the assistive technology. And so those that didn't see the ministerial videos this morning, they are now live on the Contact YouTube channel. So, okay, so another question is coming about the SENDIAS service. So obviously the DFE funding for SENDIAS will stop in March. So how can we make sure that LAs are, fulfilling their statutory duty to provide minimum standards of a SENDIAS service? So, moving forward, and obviously, how do the DFE going to make sure that there is support out there for parent carers and young people to enable them to access the service more fully, you know, if the DFE funding is stopped?
Right. I mean, it's a great chance to talk about some of the good work of the CENDIAS service. I mean, again, many of you will be aware that these used to be the parent partnership services. They evolved into CENDIAS, and that was part of the reforms. And because of their significantly changing role and the extension of the age range as well, the department wanted to provide some additional funding to support their development. So really since 2014, there has been some additional funding support, but that's not the only form of support there has been. There's been a lot of training for new CENDIAS workers, and the CDC has been commissioned to run a network of support for them, for their professional development and for an annual workshop together. The CENDIAS service has really evolved into a high quality service across the country. And it's really interesting when you read almost every single inspection report, CENDIAS services receive high levels of acclaim. I would guess that if we counted it up, it's the best reported service of all the ones there are. So again, I think that's a real tribute to the development there's been since 2014 and the efforts the department and others have put in to support that growth. They are a statutory service. Local authorities are under a statutory duty to provide information and other services. And that's just one of many services that local authorities are statutorily required to provide. So it is a service that local authorities will continue to have to provide. The amount of funding that we've given to support them over the years has tailored off. So it's been going down and down to give that message that our contribution has been to support their growth and development. And we're now at a point where there is a high level of good quality CENDIAS services. What's also been an important part of their development as a result of the reforms has been the relationship with other agencies, particularly health. And there is a general expectation that other agencies support the CENDIAS services. So there is, you could call it joint commissioning, other funding support. And many, many CENDIAS services do have that in place. We want to encourage that for all. In fact, I was with an authority meeting last week, an authority with some difficulties, but one of the messages was that health were putting in enough funding from next April for an additional full-time worker. So there's plenty going on, but we do think that CENDIAS services are now at a point in their development and maturity that they have got that professional support and development. So next year's, there is a tender out at the moment for support for them. So we can't really say how that will look until we've made the final decision on selection. But the tender did ask people to bid in to provide ongoing training and support for CENDIAS services, as well as continuing their network. So we will wait and see how that pans out. But I think CENDIAS services are in a good state of affairs. We can celebrate their work. And I think that local authorities know that it's in their own interests to keep this service going.
Thank you, Andre. And Suzy, did you want to add anything to that, or do you think Andre's answered that question fully?
No, I think Andre's been really comprehensive. Thanks, Andre.
He has. Thank you. Okay, so there's lots of questions about different parts of the DFE work and how they work together. And make sure that each department is working hand in hand. So what progress has been made to date to ensure that the DFE internally are working in a more cohesive, joined up way between the SEND departments and mainstream teams in terms of looking at not just academic achievement, but overall progress of those pupils that have SEND, for instance?
Yeah, thanks, Tina, and thanks to those that put questions in on this. So, I mean, just for a bit of context, so I've been in the Department of Education since July. So it's been quite interesting to see sort of what the journey has been. And I think my reflection is sort of 5 months in that actually we're working across the department in a pretty joined up way. And I know you'd have listened to sort of our minister's speech earlier on, and I'm sure that you've seen his letter to parents and all of the other communication that he's been putting out. Now he's been really clear in all his communication that he is incredibly focused on getting mainstream provision right. And that's great. I'm sure that is welcome for you to hear, but actually that gives us as officials a really, really good opportunity to then make even better links and even better sort of join up across the department and beyond, quite frankly, so into other government departments like health in particular. Just a few examples of that, just to kind of give a bit of colour. So you'd have seen that the school's white paper has been trailed and due to publication in the new year. But one of our focuses in the sort of the development of that across the department is making sure that that really considers vulnerable and disadvantaged cohorts kind of every step of the way, and make sure that there is alignment between what's in the white paper and also what's in the ongoing SEND review and actually the Children's Social Care Review, which is being done independently, but we're making sure that there's some alignment there. And I think the second, my reflection, is the way that the SEND review is operating. Now, it's not my lead, but we obviously work very closely with the SEND review team. And my observation is that the links across the department on that are working really, really well. And there's a lot of engagement across DfE and into other government departments about sort of making that work and coming together. And I think just kind of more parochially, what I see in my team are really good relationships between parts of the department like workforce and teacher training, to make sure that there is just that continued focus, taking the reviews and kind of big strategic white papers aside, that all teachers that teach all children, including those with SEND, and my observation is that message definitely goes through. So that's my observation 5 months in. I don't know if you'd want to add anything to that, Andre.
I would just like to add, and this isn't, that evidence that we are joining up with other departments in the other teams in the department, my email inbox attests to that, and so does Suzy's. We are being, particularly, I mean, with the white paper development, for example, we're being constantly asked for contributions to why the department thinking and how they can take account of children with special educational needs and other disadvantaged groups. So that's one measure of the heightened level of joined up work. It is going on, and actually it can be quite demanding at particular phases.
I'm glad it's not just my email address that's busy, Andre, because we get asked a lot as well.
Yeah, so there's another testament, because we constantly educate other teams in the department about the need to engage with parent groups like yourselves and the value of co-production. It is one of our messages to other teams when they're developing policy.
Thank you for that. I'm busy because of you, Andre. I think that's what we're getting from this. Yeah. So the next question is, so how can we make sure that the DfE reassure our communities that they have a shared agenda across the department when we see information from some parts that have not considered the impact of the SEND population? So I think that's quite an interesting question. Who wants to pick up on that?
I can. So I mean, I think it would be good to have some specific examples kind of outside the room. I think I'd probably refer back to kind of the way that our minister is describing how he wants to work across the department, how he wants to make sure that he is listening to stakeholders and listening to communities, but also feeding that back into the wider department and across governments. And he speaks about this very frequently, very powerfully. And there's nothing better than having a minister that sort of speaks in those terms, because as I said before, it gives us real power to do the same. So that would be, I think, the biggest thing that I could say in terms of reassurance is what you hear on the outside is what's happening on the inside.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question is about schools. So in regard to supporting schools to include children with SEND effectively and achieve good outcomes, What's the view to ensure that all schools take on their social responsibility and accept SEND pupils as a percentage of their local population? There's quite a few questions, so I'll break it up. So we'll go to the next question in a minute once you've answered that, if that's all right, Suzy, because there's quite a few.
I think they were coming my way, but actually I think, Tina, if you could go through the three of them, because in a way they do blend together, I think, to tell ask the big picture about the mainstream school agenda at the moment.
Yeah, I can do it if you like. So I'll go back to the first question. So what's the view to ensure all schools take on their social responsibility and accept SEND pupils as a percentage of their local population? How is the DfE supporting local authorities who no longer have a say in academy schools to ensure these schools are inclusive for SEND pupils? And how is the DfE ensuring that schools provide robust, ordinarily available support to SEND pupils?
Okay, thank you. And this is a big question and a big answer. And again, I think you'll have taken from the messages from the Secretary of State and the Minister that the review is going to be very focused on the mainstream agenda. And it's because the mainstream agenda is generating the type of questions that you've just read out, Tina. And I think it is about how do we get better at helping schools or making schools, whichever way you look at it, take on social responsibility. How can local authorities influence practice more and pick up problems and be more problem solving? And what are we doing around ordinarily available provision? So those are elements that I think were underneath what the Secretary of State and the Minister were referring to, because we know, and the review has openly said, the focus will be very much on improving mainstream schools, improving the offer from mainstream schools, the levels of accountability, and sort of recourse when there are issues. I mean, I think if we start at the beginning, when you look at the legislation and the code of practice, it is actually very exacting on schools. And I think one of the things we don't do enough is recognize when it's going well. And I would ask all of you in parent-carer forums to make sure that you know at your fingertips which are the good schools in your local area, which are the ones that you pull out as good practice. And there are plenty of them around who parents value and who get good inspections. And I think we need to remember that there's a lot of schools that are doing a good job. The problem we've got is the few who aren't are causing problems for others and giving SEN and inclusion a bad name. And that's something we need to address as fully as we can. So there is a strong element of what schools should be doing. Where I think we've got some issues is in accountability when the few that don't do it. And I think there are mixed lines of responsibility and accountability that we're hoping will be picked up in the future. There was a question about the challenge of academies and local authority powers and so on. I mean, I think, again, whenever a problem comes up about a school, it's usually seen as an academy. And again, we need to remember that actually over 80% of secondary schools today are academies. So if you're going to get a secondary school problem, it's highly likely it will be an academy. So that in itself, it's not surprising that many of the problems for the secondary population seem to fall within academies, because that's the case. But remember that the legislation, the code of practice, has equal requirements on academies and maintained schools. They should be doing nothing different. Where there is complication is back in that point I was making earlier about accountability and who you go to for support and challenge. And again, there are routes in, but they're clunky and not easily manageable. But if a local authority names an academy in a plan, the child must be admitted. Obviously, that's not always straightforward, but the laws are equally exacting on academies. I did want to say a bit about the school inspection framework. I do think the 2019 changes, particularly that judgment about the quality of education, has made schools think much harder about children with SEN, and leaders are being judged on how well they construct a curriculum that is right for children with SEN as well as for others. And some schools have fallen foul of this because they haven't been able to demonstrate that. I think this has pushed forward some good practice as well as highlighting some poor practice. So I think that Ofsted inspection, although is never to be seen as a panacea, has helped. We also know, don't we, that Ofsted has been picking up examples of off-rolling, which I know is a concern in our community. And they have written in some inspections criticisms of a school management team because of off-rolling. And some of you may have seen in the press in November, 3 leaders from an academy trust were found guilty by the Teacher Regulation Agency of misconduct because they were off-rolling. I mean, that's extremely serious. And the fact that it gets into the national media is a big deterrent. And I think, we all need to recognize that the system is trying to address that. Okay, we've openly challenged it, Ofsted are onto it, and there's even been some individual cases like that, which is very serious and rare. So we are doing a lot on the agenda. You asked about ordinarily available provision.
I did.
And again, you'll have seen in the open letter from the minister that concern that he expressed in terms of sort of local variation in what's happening, the so-called postcode lottery. And we know of some local areas that have got good examples published on their website of ordinarily available provision, normally available provision. And I know that some of your colleagues present today have worked with some local authorities, but some of them haven't published anything. Some have published offers that aren't terribly understandable or terribly realistic. And again, that might be something that the review will make observations about and may try to take further forward to reduce that local variation and ensure there's much greater predictability about what's on offer locally. And just finally, I think we're continuing to support schools through commissioned work. Through NASON, we're funding the Whole School Send organisation, which many of you will have had contact with. That works directly with schools to improve their inclusivity and their offer for all children. Okay, I'll stop there. There's a lot one could say, but I hope the message is clear that we know there's a lot more to be done in mainstream to get equality of offer and approaches to children with SEND in operation.
And obviously, there's lots of work that's ongoing, which will hopefully clear any sort of clunky pathways, shall we put it in. There's a reference to that in the chat around accountabilities and those that want to complain about academies or schools or whatever they want to complain about. And I think there's just lots of work ongoing, isn't there, that will hopefully see some differences early part of next year.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool, thank you. Okay, so the next question is about SEN transport, which forums often get inundated around. So many forums report issues with SEN transport, with many councils looking to slash their SEND transport budget, which will affect many of our children's ability to access school. What is the DFE's view on this?
Yeah, I think I've picked up this lovely question of SEN transport, which is always a lovely question.
Always, and it always happens literally as the children go back to school. I don't know what it is, but the timing of SEN transport is a nightmare. Yes, so Andre, are you answering this?
I'm going to try, definitely. I mean, I think, firstly, there are laws about this. It's pretty clear which children are entitled under the law to free transport. In summary, it's those who cannot walk to school because of their special educational need or because they've got a mobility problem. And that also applies, it does not matter how far away they live. So that 2 and 3 mile rule that applies for other children does not apply for those who are entitled because of SEN or disability. So the law is very clear. We also need to recognise, and we talked about the £9 billion that's being spent on high needs from next April. On top of that, there's almost £1 billion going on SEN transport. It's a huge amount of resource, but it's in addition to the high needs budget. But it is a huge resource, and like any provision, local authorities are under a duty to keep their provision arrangements under review. So they need to constantly review that, as they should the provision of other services. And they need to keep their policies under review. And many authorities have operated approaches which go way beyond the legal entitlement that an individual has. I mean, about 3 or 4 years ago, I went to a school, a special school, and I was sitting down having lunch with some of the kids, and they were all having transport. Everyone in the school was having transport, regardless of whether they needed it or not. And I think, that's another point to remember, that there is a legal entitlement, and many local authorities have been putting in more than that. We also need to recognise that individual children in receipt of free transport, again, it's right that that's kept under review about that individual child. A child who receives free transport at the age of 5 may not need it by the age of 12, 13, 14. They may have, their challenges at 5 may have been overcome enough for them not to actually fit the legal criteria for receipt of free transport. So it is right that local authorities keep that under review, not just their general policy, but also the individual child. So I think it's right, but ultimately local authorities have a statutory duty to provide for those who have a statutory entitlement. And I know that some have gone beyond it. And I think someone's just posted something, hi Ros, where they've conflated the mileage rule with SEN. Actually, firstly, do they know they've got it wrong? I mean, that's always my first question, because because local authorities are operating transport for all children as well as for those with SEN, and sometimes the people working with it don't fully understand the full range of rules. So challenge them in the first instance, make sure that they see it may be a basic error, these things happen, but it may not be, and certainly I would certainly start by getting the Parent Carer Forum to talk to the head of SEN, because often transport people in local authorities and SEN people, I know it may be difficult to believe, but they don't always talk to each other or don't talk enough to each other. So getting people to make sure that they understand that, they're out of order, then ultimately there is legal recourse. And I know 1 or 2 local authorities have had threats of JR on this, and they've usually retracted from where they are.
Okay. In regards to the chat, if we haven't got time to go through the questions, we will do a Q&A thing that we did it last year, actually, where we had lots in the chat. And what we did was we developed a Q&A paper that we then put on the website. So that's what we'll do in this instance, because I know that time's ticking. So then no one feels left out. So obviously with the new money and the amount of money that's been put forward, and the fact that we're having new schools built all the time, in particular SEND builds, we're hearing across the country that some of them have been stalled, some of them have been cancelled. Obviously, some of them it's down to COVID and lack of supplies, I hear, on the ground. So it in a time when local provision is like gold dust, so we don't want kids travelling out of counties or across a massive county, with free school contracts given to MATs, what's happening in regards to these builds, and sometimes when MATs are involved, they haven't consulted or engaged with a parent carer forum either in local areas. So what's happening in regards to these new builds? What's been the issues? I know you're aware of any issues, first and foremost.
I'll take this one, Tina. This actually cropped up when you and Runal very kindly invited me to your steering group last month. And I took some homework away to go and sort of do a bit of digging in the department to see what was happening. I mean, there is a team in the department, you'll be relieved to know, that does work closely with local authorities on sort of monitoring capital programmes, how they're going, and working with them on any delays. They said, I found there are definitely a handful across the country which the pace has not been what you'd want. Again, the reasons will be multifaceted, but I'd also heard that there were supply chain issues sitting behind them potentially. But it wasn't, from the research that I did, it wasn't a widespread issue or seen as one. So I'd be really grateful for any specific examples to be passed back to us, and then I can pass them back and we can do a bit more questioning. But that's the sort of position that I did when I did that bit of digging. So that's kind of on the kind of the existing ones and the position of those. On the kind of the new build side of things, so I'm sure you all saw that at spending review, we got 2.6 billion of capital funding over the SR, so over the next 3 years, for both new places and improving existing provision for Pcfs SEND and AP as well. We're just working through with ministers how that's going to work, and whether we're working through how that's distributed and how that will work with local authorities. So that's a kind of watch this space on that front. But we were really delighted to get that additional funding. And again, and we talked earlier about sort of the SEND sort of in the Department of Education. And I think our view is that getting a cash injection like this in an environment that we're in terms of government finances is a really positive thing, and says quite a lot about where the sort of provision of SEND, both capital and revenue, is got a decent profile compared to the rest of government. So we're pretty pleased with that, and we'll let you know what the next steps are.
Thank you. And those people who submitted a question about that, they will give us the examples, so you will be getting them.
Thank you.
So obviously with the talk of the white paper for academies and academisation, comes with it the behavioural policies that seem to be in place a lot in academies, more than mainstream primaries, for instance. And it tends to be in secondaries, but they're not alone. So behavioural policies, particularly in the last 2 terms, are creating additional anxiety in schools and impacting on attendance. How is the DfE monitoring failed attendance due to these new policies rather than general refusal to attend? And I think one of the comments that sort of come back is there an opportunity where we can look at how children are registered and having maybe a different registration code is a possibility and a question. So how is the DfE going to measure the impact of the behavioural hubs in schools, and how will they review it against the success of the NHS Autism in Schools project, and how can we bring those learnings together to make it more cohesive? And what has happened to the reasonable adjustments, recommendations and resources that has been undertaken by the Autism Educational Trust? When can we expect to see these published is the question. I can read them out again because it's quite a mammoth question.
I might ask you to come to the second 2. I'll take the first one first, and thank you for putting these questions in. And I think just to sort of state the obvious at the beginning, I mean, we are acutely aware that the experience of the past 18 months and the disruption it's brought to children and families and schools has been completely unprecedented. And it's part of our job is making sure that we support schools to actually re-establish the routines, the safe environment and everything for all pupils, including those with SEND, so they're put in the best position possible to learn. Now, of course, a good school is going to know how to tackle this and create the environment where all the children that they've got in their care can thrive. Of course, there will be some schools that don't succeed in that, and that is where some of the sort of initiatives like behaviour hubs and the new attendance advisors, that's where they come in to kind of to use a slightly laboured phrase, to kind of level up across different schools about how they're actually handling the kind of the residual impact of all of the challenges that we've been facing over the past 18 months. So that's on the sort of the first part of it. Was your next question about behavioural hubs and measuring success of those?
Yeah, so how is the DfE going to measure the impact of the behavioural hub schools, and how will they review its success against the NHS Autism in Schools project, which is currently being sort of going out through its regions?
Yeah.
And how can we bring the learning together? So how can we learn from the two projects separately, but bring the learning together to make a more cohesive approach, I think would be.
Yeah, okay, no, that's fine, thank you. So behaviour hubs, as I understand it, an independent evaluator has been appointed to assess how effective the hubs are. They'll be publishing an interim report. I mean, it's not going to be immediate, so I think it's in the next financial year, 23-24. On the Autism in School project, as it stands, I don't think there's a formal plan to directly compare the two. But I think once the final report of the behavioural hubs report is out, then we'll be able to make a better call on how we compare the effectiveness of those two programmes to kind of other school improvement initiatives.
Cool. And the last question in this section is, what's happened to the reasonable adjustment recommendations and resources that was being undertaken by the AET, so the Autism Educational Trust, and when can we expect to see this published?
Okay, so I think I'm going to have to take that one away. I mean, what I can say is that the kind of the contract that we've got with the Autism Education Trust is still ongoing, so it's still going to the end of this financial year. So AET is still delivering their training, they're still developing the practical resources and doing sort of information and advice services to families who are dealing with suspension and permanent exclusion of children. But I'll take away the specific point around the reasonable adjustments recommendations.
Okay, thank you.
I just add to that to link that reasonable adjustments to the work of the behaviour hubs, because some of the materials that have been developed for use by the behavioural hub work do include reference to the Equality Act and to the need to make reasonable adjustments for those with a recognised disability. So it's very much on that agenda.
Thank you. And we'll add that into the Q&A sheet that we're going to do, and we can publish it, because there's lots of things in the chat, including a London borough that should have had their SEMH school. So that's one area where you asked for information, Suzy, and we're getting it in the chat. So we'll touch base with you after this call. So what are the DfE planning to do to recognise the value of parent care forums in their place in local systems as joint working partners at a strategic level, such as increasing their funding or facilitating joint funding across departments? And how can the DfE support the sustainability of co-production and joint working without national benchmarking and quality assurance frameworks in place to facilitate sustainability in local systems?
Great, thanks. I'm taking those too, Tina. I'll take them. I'll try and bundle them together, and then maybe come back on the second question with some additional detail. So
they're quite lengthy questions. I'm trying to group them together because they're similar, but equally, so I'm happy to come back to it, Suzy. So yeah, please.
Excellent, thank you. So on the first about the value of Pcfs, and I think we spoke at the beginning a bit around sort of the how sort of SEND workings in the Department of Education. And I think Andre reflected on the size of our inboxes, as did Tina. And I think that speaks to sort of the recognition of the value of all of the work that you are all doing in your different sort of localities, and how the information that you can provide back to us genuinely feeds into the policy work and the sort of delivery work that we do. So that's just a kind of like a broad reflection, I think, on the sort of how it's going. The specific question around funding in here. So, I mean, as you'll know, we're kind of, for this financial year, we've still got the strategic participation contract, which puts out the grant of up to 17,500 to each PCF. to support all the work that you're doing. And I think that was increased from the year before. Now, obviously, everything that we've got going from this next April onwards is all part of the spending review settlement, which isn't confirmed yet. We haven't internally done all of the bean counting to see what goes where, but we're prioritising it within the department as something that we want to get an answer to quite rapidly. So again, it's a kind of watch this space, and as soon as we know the outcome, we'll be able to announce what that means for Pcfs in the next financial year. But I think just some other reflections on the sort of the work that we're doing. I mean, we've spoken a bit around that kind of email inboxes, but the kind of the way that we have been trying to embed the views of Pcfs in the big bits of policy development that we're doing, whether that's COVID or whether it's otherwise, I think again demonstrates the value of the sort of the intelligence, the influence of what you're doing. So, for example, Tina and Munal are sitting on the SEND Review steering group and playing a huge role in influencing the direction that review is taking, and also on the COVID-19 recovery advisory group, again right at the top of the department, sort of advising kind of senior folk on sort of how COVID is sort of affecting children and young people with SEND and their families, but also how some of these kind of broad recovery efforts can and should work for children and families with SEND. So I hope that all sort of just goes to show kind of the value that not just us, but the department as a whole sort of places on the work that you all do.
Thank you. I think to add on to that, I think normally by now we would know where we are for the next financial year. And of course, I know you're not going to reveal any dark secret here because you can't. But I think, you know, it's worth noting that we are still waiting for that contract decision. And then obviously we will know where we stand. And maybe that's where one of the questions has come from, really. So the second part of this question is, how can the DfE support sustainability of co-production and joint working without national benchmarking and quality assurance frameworks in place to facilitate sustainability in the local systems? So it's the localised view rather than national.
Yeah. So I was reading this question. I was wondering if it was partly a funding question, but partly a SEND review future systems question. I think that's what the second part of the question is.
It's definitely yes, because obviously local authorities should confer and co-produce with forums. They don't always, and equally there are still forums that aren't funded by their local authority or CCGs, and you know, 17,500 is great. However, it's not great for doing co-production. It doesn't go a long way. So I think that's where this question is coming from. So how can we make sure that actually there is that equitability? There's forums that get loads of funding, and then there's forums that don't get any. So I think it's around that as well.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. So I think on the kind of the future systems side, I mean, it's something that the SEND Review is looking really closely at a kind of a macro level, sort of thinking through how best and how reliably parents' voice and the voice of children and young people can feed through effectively. So I think sort of dealing with some of the issues that you've just referred to there, Tina. I think the other thing that it's worth saying, and it may feel a bit tangential, but we're doing a lot of work at the moment with the Department of Health and Social Care on the implementation of ICSs and integrated care systems, integrated care boards, integrated care partnerships, just to make sure that however kind of early days the kind of implementation of that is, making sure that we're not missing a trick in making sure that the whatever is set up and how it's going to work at a local level doesn't make the issues that are described here get amplified even more. So that's the sort of another sort of thing that we're doing, trying to do at system level, but making sure that we understand how that's panning out in individual healthcare economies, in terms of implementing ICSs, to make sure that we're not sort of missing out and not missing a trick.
Thank you. So the next question's around.
Can I just add to what
yes,
Suzy was just saying? I mean, I think just in relation to sustainability, it's always helpful for us to keep on having the concrete evidence of the impact and the value of parent-carer forums and the type of work you do and the difference it makes. It's always helpful to have that up our sleeves for discussions internally about sustaining your work. So keep that coming. And
obviously when local areas are inspected, it does come up at how they co-produce with forums, and there have been inspection reports that reflect that. And you know, so hopefully moving forward that could help as well. Okay, so EHCPs, we always come up with these questions around EHCPs and annual reviews, don't we? At every opportunity. So if EHCPs do not need to be updated every year at annual review, how are families and the local authority able to hold the school to account and make and carry out the changes required? How are the DfE tracking if LAs are making input to annual review process, especially at year 9 transitions? This is about how reviews are not just, you know, the local authorities often don't attend these reviews, and how are the DfE ensuring that local authorities are supporting schools to ensure a holistic annual review across health and social care, not just education?
Yeah.
There is one more question, but I'll leave that because that's quite a mammoth one, and you can answer that first.
Right, well, thank you. EHC plans annual reviews, big issue and big numbers. And I think when, you know, in 2014, the number of annual reviews to be done was probably around 200,000. It's now around 400,000. So there's a massive volume to be managed. Local authorities, I mean, clearly the guidance, the statutory requirements, local authorities must carry out an annual review. That does not mean they attend meetings, but they must carry out and manage and lead and decide upon the process. We're very clear in the Code of Practice that plans are not expected to be amended on a frequent basis, on an annual basis. We don't say exactly when they should be amended, obviously the year 6 transition, etc. And the time of leaving school is a must, but we say that they don't need to be done annually. But local authorities need to make a decision annually. They need to make a decision as to, on the basis of the review that's usually been held in the school or the college, they need to make a decision. And it's a three things they can choose from: to maintain the plan as it is now, which I think is what most of the decisions are. They can amend the plan, or they can cease the plan. That's a very rare occurrence. So it's usually between maintain and amend. So they have to make a decision, and they have to inform parents of that decision. And with that, it carries the right of appeal. So every year there is that possibility of appealing about that decision. So that's a high level of accountability on the local authority. Local authorities also, remember, they're giving, in almost every one of these instances, they're giving top-up funding to schools to deliver provision, usually for a year until the next year, and they will be looking at how they are getting value for money from that. So that's another part of the system for making sure that local authorities are paying attention to what's being provided from schools. We also, at a slightly separate level, again, I think you mentioned it, but the inspections are paying more and more attention to annual reviews, to whether they're being done and the quality of them. And I think, I mean, pretty much all the ones that have reported this calendar year have mentioned annual reviews, often with problems attached to them. But I was pleased to see one the other day that said, annual reviews are happening within timescales and any required changes to plans and provision are done in a timely way. And that's the that's where we want to get to for all, isn't it? So we've made sure that the inspection process since 2016, when it didn't really mention annual reviews, has increasingly shone a spotlight on that. And I think another thing that's coming on that will influence or help to improve practice and timeliness is changes to the data collection, and we're going to have a pupil-led data system that will enable data to be published on timeliness generally and on the completion of annual reviews. It's likely the first publication will be in 2023. It's not absolutely certain, but this will be driving change. Many of you will also be aware that we have been running an annual training course on annual reviews. The advisor team has been delivering that. And it's attended by health and social care, who I think are part of the question, how do we ensure that they're engaged? The first thing is they need to know that they are expected to be engaged. So that's part of the aim of the training. So some of you will have attended that in the last couple of years, and there is another round starting in January. So we're again looking for regional representatives to come along to that. The other thing that always does is it includes from the region we ask one local authority that's got good or interesting practice to present about that. So there's a number of strands that are improving the annual review process and trying to drive better operation at the meeting stage.
Thank you. And the last question of this EHCPs is and annual reviews is, how are the DfE ensuring that local authorities follow up on the promise to review quality of plans, rushed meet statement, plan transition cut-off? So obviously those early transitions as well, you know, they rush them through, don't they, because there seems to be an influx. Are you looking at the quality of those plans in particular that are being rushed through?
We're now 3 years on since the last one of those was done. What we've done, and that's in part why I talked about the increased focus from the inspectors on the inspection process, is partly to look at that, to make sure that plans are up to date and are being amended in a timely way. That was part of that drive to look at the transfers. And many, many children will have reached a transition point, either year 6 or later on, that were part of that sort of flood in 2016, 17, 18 of transfers, and will have had their plans amended accordingly since then. And again, if a parent actually feels that their plan is one of those rushed ones, as they say, when at an annual review, they have the ability to challenge what's been provided.
Thank you. Okay, so the next set of questions are around home education. So there have been a huge increase in the number of home educated children and young people in Brighton and Hove since the start of the pandemic. This includes a doubling of the number of home educated students with an EHCP. Is this a national trend, and what do you see is the reason behind it? What support do those students and families need that, you know, who want to continue with home education? And what support do those students and families need to be able to get back into a suitable provision that is suitable for the child's needs? And the last bit is, what are the DfE doing to look at the reasons on increased, and it's got elective in commas, home educated, and address the gaps in provision and understanding what might be driving this?
Mm-hmm. Okay, another very big subject area, and one of, let's say, increased interest as a direct result of the pandemic. Again, you're aware that we don't formally collect data on children who are home educated, but we are aware of an increase in the numbers who are. Our colleagues in the Association of Directors of Children's Services, the ADCS, do collect data from local authorities, and they share that with us. So we know that over 80,000 children from their surveys are now being home educated, which is an increase of about 7% in a year. We also know they've collected data on education, health and care plan children. We know that around up to about 3/4 of local authorities have got about up to 5% of their total home educated children have got an education, health and care plan, and about 1/4 of local authorities have got up to 10%. So they're a small but significant group of a much larger group of children whose parents have chosen to educate them at home. The reasons, the ADCS survey also helpfully asks for reasons why a child has become home educated. And the most common reason, not surprisingly, over the last 12 months has been COVID. But also parents have cited health or emotional health reasons. I'm aware that amongst many parents, without it being sort of scientifically evidenced, but I think there's a lot of parents who say that I'm choosing to educate my child at home, not because of COVID, not because of health reasons, but simply because I'm not happy with what's being provided in the school system. And I think, you know, that's a very concerning message, and one that we want to address through continued improvement of the school system. I talked a lot about what we want to do in the mainstream sector, because it's very, very, very rare for a parent of a child in a special school to take them out and home educate them. Another important message that I think we all need to be aware, I mean, it's obviously a very serious decision to make. And I think we all need to make sure, if we are talking to parents who are considering that decision, we need to make sure that they're fully aware of all the implications and consequences of it. One of those being that a local authority is not under a duty to provide provision for a child, even if they've got an education, health and care plan. And I think a number of parents, particularly in the sort of immediacy of COVID, have thought, well, I'll educate my child at home and they'll still send the speech and language therapist to my house. Well, that's not a statutory requirement to do that. And I think we need to bear that in mind. Also, and importantly, at this moment when there is so much pressure on places in special schools, and indeed on mainstream, once a parent has made the decision to home educate their child, the child is removed from the role, and therefore it can be challenging. And there have been some parents who after 2 or 3 months have felt this wasn't the right thing for me and my child. And actually getting back to the school may not be the most straightforward thing. So I think that we need to make sure that parents, when they make this decision, are fully aware of the consequences and implications of it. The department did a consultation around improving the home education system, or regulating it, possibly. That consultation happened in the second half of 2019, and we're likely to report on that very soon. And we are publicly committed to a registration system, which I know generates some degree of controversy in the home education sector. But we think that that would be very helpful in terms of intelligence about those children and child and safeguarding issues. So it is a big issue that's got bigger, and it's one that we are doing a lot of work on. Is that okay, Tina? I mean,
yeah, that's fine. I was going to ask a little cheeky question, which obviously I didn't forward to you, but just out of interest, do you collect data around the Eotas children? And the reason why I ask that is those children that are educated other than at school. I have personally, you know, since I've worked in the parent care forum world, which was before the SEND reforms. I mean, I'd never even heard of an Eotas until probably a year into the SEND reforms. But I've seen an increase of those parents and that are requesting Eotas. Has the department seen an increase in that, or is it something that you don't measure?
Let me just.
I was being a bit cheeky. We can put it into the Q&A sort of question and answer sheet, because I've added that in because of what you were saying, Andre, which was quite fascinating. I just thought I was quite cheeky to ask about the Eotas and to keep you on your toes, of course.
No, I can tell you, Tina, that there were just about 4,000, over 4,000 children recorded as having Eotas last year, and it was an increase. And therefore, I know that we do measure it and can tell you about it.
Okay. And is that increased quite a lot over subsequent years, or is it just this COVID?
I can't juggle my
That's fine.
That's
fine. I'm being really cheeky and keeping you on your toes. I was amazed
I could find that. I can't
so quickly.
I put it like this. What we do know about the SEN system is everything seems to be on the increase. So it's probably an increase. And certainly there's been a lot of talk about it. And there was a big upper tier tribunal judgment about it recently. So yes, it's more.
So it's on your radar.
It's on our radar. And in a way, I mean, I think a lot of people confuse it with elective home education. I think it's important to realize there is a difference. It's completely
different. Yeah. But it's quite fascinating that if a provision's not right for a child, or the child is quite anxious about going to school, that Eotas is another option. But it's been quite slow about coming through the systems. Local authorities don't necessarily understand it. I think they're understanding it more, but I didn't, when it first came out, I don't think it was understood. So that's cool.
But it's more of a debate, isn't it? It's a point where they have to get to an agreement, the parent and the local authority, whereas elective home education, parents have an absolute right to that. And I think therefore it is different in terms, because a parent may think Eotas is the right thing for my child, but the local authority may not agree, whereas the local authority can't disagree on elective home education. So it is a different debate that's to be had.
Yeah. So we have now got our last question. On Suzy's disappeared. I don't know.
Oh, she's bound to be the one who's got to answer this last question. What is it?
It is what the DFE doing to see local authority children and adult social care departments have more cohesion in their approaches to prevent the cliff edge of support at 18. And actually, I would also expand that question and say, what are local authorities doing for those children that end up in adult services or known to adult social care that haven't been known to children's? So it's a double-edged thing, isn't it? Hopefully it's not too connectivity issues, possibly.
Yeah, sorry, computer's crashed. I apologise, Tina.
That's fine. Okay. Is she coming back in, Claire?
I think she's trying. She's scrambling.
We're trying to reboot, which takes a few minutes.
But if not,
I think
answer. We can send you the answer if that's better, or I don't know, under his button.
Well, we can put it onto our Q&A sheet.
Put it onto our Q&A. But what I would say is, I mean, we know about the CARE Act 2014 and the requirements to conduct that transition assessment to identify social care needs at that point of transition. We also know that doesn't happen often enough in practice, and I think the often enough not happening goes back to the Year 9 review probably not working as well as it's intended. We know that it's something that, I mean, again, another issue that I know was flagged up in either, I think it was the minister's video to you, was about the joint work with health and social care. And the review is looking at how to make that whole system better.
Thank you. And obviously there's the two reviews that are happening simultaneously. And there has been that joined up work between the SEND review and the social care review.
Yeah.
So I'm just conscious of time and the fact that we've actually run 4 minutes over, which is not bad considering how many questions we answered. But can I just take this opportunity to thank everybody who's joined the call today and taken time out of their busy day to listen to us. Thank you also to Andre, Fern and Claire, who are the DFE team, as well as Suzy, who's dropped off the call. And by the time she comes back, we'll probably have ended it, which is always the way when things, technology breaks on us. But thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And we will be posting a Q&A page on our website when we've got all the answers collated together, including the things that are in the chat, which has been quite fascinating to watch, actually. So thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you. Thank you to all, and yeah, thank you. And hopefully next year it'll be face-to-face.
Fingers crossed, that'd be great. Take care.
Okay. Yeah, cheers. Fantastic.